Hey, welcome to part B of this 15th lecture on the history of the English language, in which we talk about historical context and major text and spelling changes in Middle English. We're going to talk about the later Middle English period here, beginning in the 1200s. I'm not going to read this bullet point of important events that happened, um, but I will say that the major things that happened during this period are the relative rise in power of England in the British Isles and its regional hegemony over Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Um, the Hundred Years' War, which takes place between England and France between 1337 and 1453. 100 years is a approximation. Another important event that happens is the Black Death in 1348, which kills approximately a third of Europe. Um, Not unrelated, in 1381 is the Great Uprising, where workers and laborers revolt in England against laws that are attempting to hold down wages, which have been artificially suppressed in the wake of a labor shortage after the Black Death. Um, Relevant much? And then some other stuff happens. The deposition of Richard, the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, and the establishment of the Lancastrian dynasty, which will result down the line in the Wars of the Roses. In the meantime, we talked last time about how Oxford was founded. 1209 Cambridge University is founded. And London, Oxford, and Cambridge together will have an important role to play in, they form a kind of triangle in southeastern England. And in that triangle, the kind of English that's spoken there will become what post-colonial scholars call the metropolitan standard. It becomes official English, and everything else becomes a dialect, right? I had a linguistics professor once who said that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Speaking of army and navies, it's during the 1300s, during the Hundred Years' War, when English identity, as distinct from French, is developing more among the upper classes. And it's at this time that we see a gradual reemergence of English as a prestige language, which goes hand in hand with the development of elite works of vernacular literature, such as those by the Gawain poet and Chaucer, and more popular religious literature, too, like Langland's Piers Plowman. In 1362, as I said, Edward III, that's this Ice King dude, will open Parliament in English. Also in the late 1300s, a religious scholar named John Wycliffe, who had a lot of ideas which would later be taken up again and recirculated by Lutherans and Calvinists, translated the Bible into English and other people were writing religious works in English, and these came to be actively suppressed in the 1400s. The 1300s was a crazy time. It was Barbara Tuchman, in her famous book A Distant Mirror, refers to it as the calamitous 14th century. There was climate change. There was a kind of a global cooling in Europe after what was referred to as the medieval warming period. In 150 years before Chaucer's time, you could grow wine in England, and this was no longer the case. So there was cattle disease, and there was a crop failure, and there were all kinds of problems that happened in the 1300s, which went hand in hand with the bubonic plague that spread through Europe and killed a great many people and disrupted society. And on the left-hand image here, you can see medieval flagellants, people who are whipping themselves to atone for the sins of themselves and mankind, hoping to be spared perhaps the plague. On the right, you can see young King Richard going to meet the assembled mob of peasants uprising to tell them to go home and give up their claims. This mob wanted to abolish all noble titles except for that of king, and redistribute land evenly among all the peasants. Richard, young King Richard, he was 14 at the time, agreed to this, but then he had the leaders of the uprising arrested and hung as traitors. So that didn't end up working out for the peasants revolting at all. And before you're like, oh, these peasants are so based and cool, They also went around London attacking every foreigner they could. So, history is complicated. In the later Middle English period, we talked about Wycliffe and his ideas and how they were heterodox. They were not good Catholic ideas, and they were suppressed. And vernacular religious writing was suppressed in the 1400s. The new Lancastrian dynasty, in fact, which had usurped the old dynasty, were anxious to sort of prove their legitimacy. And one way to do that was to be very, very staunch about supporting the church officials and get them on their side. In 1415, we think the 100 Years' War is over because Henry V manages to win, but he dies of dysentery not long after. And that's rough, buddy. And his son is a baby, and things kind of fall apart. And in 1453, the French defeat the English finally. The only bit of France that's still held by England is the port of Calais in Normandy, which they will hold until, I think, late in the reign of Henry VIII. During the later 1400s, you have a period that at the time was called the Cousins' War, but was known retroactively as the Wars of the Roses, which was a dynastic struggle between different houses of England. It's all it's the Yorks and the Lancasters, and if that sounds like Starks and Lannisters, it's no accident. George Martin based his narrative in a good part on English history. And in 1485, Henry VII will end the Wars of the Roses finally at the Battle of Bosworth Field when he defeats Richard III. And at this time will establish the Tudor dynasty, which will last until the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603. And this period, the 1480s, is widely considered the end of the Middle Ages by historians. After this, we get into the Renaissance or the early modern period. Through this period, we also have a number of cultural and technological developments that are important for the change in the English language. Through the 13 and the 1400s, you have an intensification of administrative government, of officials keeping records, drawing up contracts, a kind of written administration of the government. And this was handled by a couple of organizations based around Westminster in London that were known collectively as the Chancery, where they produced standardized formal government documents. And the writing, the forms of writing that they used there, the spellings that they used, for example, TH instead of the thorn or the eth character, or using GH at the end of words instead of the yog character, became a part of standard English spelling, and were similar to how scribes in London, who, for example, copied many copies of Chaucer's or the Gawain poets or Gower's literary works, used those same spelling conventions. And so that had a very important effect on the kind of standardization of the English language coming out of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. And this was intensified by the fact that these spelling conventions were adopted by William Caxton. William Caxton introduced printing to England in 1476 and printed works of English literature, including Malory's Morte d'Arthur, as well as a number of Latin works and stuff like that. In the 1400s, we also have various works that are important corpora, for the study of the English of the period, including the York plays, which were cycles of folk religious dramas, essentially, that used the everyday language of the people, as well as what are called the Paston letters, a huge collection of letters written among members of a family in the upper gentry, which also collects a whole lot of what linguists call unmonitored usage of the language. So this is just a little bit about the historical context of the later Middle English period, the important political and technological and cultural developments that affected the history of the English language. And all of this affects spelling. So let's just briefly talk about spelling in the late Middle English period, or in the Middle English period. For one thing, long vowels become spelled with double vowels. So the Old English B-O-C, book, is spelled book in B-O-O-K. And there's pronounced the same at this time. The ash character, which is the ligature, the tied together A and E, is just replaced by the letter A. So father with the ash becomes father with an A. CG in Old English, as in edge, is replaced by DG or J, as in edge with the EDGE, not ECG. So we have a number of spelling changes which are on the table shown here. CW becomes QE. HW, as in what or while, becomes WH or sometimes QU. The thorn and eth characters are replaced by TH. SC, as in ship, becomes SH, as in ship. The C letter just made the sound ch before a high front vowel, as in child, child in Old English, but that comes to be spelled as CH in modern English, in Middle English and later. The H is replaced by a yod or a GH, as in enoch, which becomes enough. Enough. So all of these changes in spelling happen because a lot of the people responsible for writing texts in English during the Middle English period are also writing texts in French and in Latin. And French already has, these Norman scribes already have a well-developed set of conventions for how they will write French, and these are carried over into English in order, and they want to avoid ambiguity and confusion. So, for example, that C that makes a ch sound before a high front vowel in English makes a s sound before a high or a front vowel in French, and so they're like, we can't have that. It'll confuse people who are trying to read this because these old texts are clearly they were spelling their own language wrong. So they change it from C to CH, and a number of other changes happen, including, for example, the addition of E at the end of a word to make a long vowel. There were two ways in Middle English that a long vowel was indicated. One was by doubling the vowel, like in book or beat or feet or foot or loot or boot, or you could just add an E after the consonant if it was a closed vowel, like bowed or wide or slide, and so on and so forth. So those are the changes in spelling in Middle English. I hope that this has been relentlessly fascinating for you. In the next video, in the next few videos, we're going to get into the nitty gritty of Middle English grammar. The next one we'll talk about phonology of Middle English, and the one after that we'll talk about morphology. Thank you for joining me. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.